Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the implications of not using the Azure regional pairs. Now we hear a lot about the Azure regional pairs and a lot of customers will align to them as part of their architecture for good reasons. But Azure has grown a lot over the years. It continues to grow. There's more regions, there's more services that make that regional pairing alignment possibly problematic. So if we think about those regional pairings, I can imagine, well, there's my region 1, and then I have some other region, my region 2. And the point of this pairing is they are typically hundreds of miles apart. So we have a very big geographical distance. The idea being, if I think of a blast radius of some problem, a natural disaster, some issue, well, if it impacts this region, it should not impact the paired region because it should be a huge, huge distance away. And we can look at the documentation and see what are those paired regions. It talks about pair A and pair B. So we see all these different regions are paired. Now, typically, they will try and stay in the same political boundary, the same geopolitical boundary, the same country, for example, or they're trying to stay in Europe. So you can see United States, there's a bunch of pairings. So we have all these various pairings around them. And if I focus on these pairs, I mentioned, well, there's a big distance between them. So if there's a problem, it will help me with that. But there are a number of other pros and there are some potential cons when I use these paired regions. So if I think from a pro perspective, I get services like storage, geo-redundant storage. So for my storage, very, very simply, I can just say, yes, I want geo-redundant storage. And we're going to talk in detail about these. And I'll now get an asynchronous replica in the paired region of everything in my storage account. So that's great. Kind of piggybacking off of that to a certain extent, I then get Key Vault replication to the paired region. So if there was some problem in the primary region, hey, that Key Vault was created in this region, but its materials would be replicated to the paired region. When Azure does its changes, it doesn't just roll everything out all at once. Azure does this staged rollout in rings of its changes. And so one of the big things here is when it does that staged rollout, it won't update both regions in a pair at the same time. So I get this certain ability for Azure staged rollout. Additionally, they talk about priority remediation. So if there was some big issue that affected lots and lots of regions, they would try and prioritize one region in each pair. I've not seen that typically the way that the fixes work, that there's a certain amount of testing of it, and then it will be a much broader, very fast rollout. That is a potential that would do priority region restore. So there are benefits in using the paired region. Now, potentially, and just to balance this a little bit, I think there are some cons. If there was some scenario where this region was just unavailable and I'm using the paired region along with many, many other customers, I think there's definitely a scenario of run on the bank of the resources of this region. If everyone using region 1, they all try and use region 2, I think there would be a clash of trying to get access to all of the resources. So I think a potential con is run on the bank. If every customer tried to start all their resources on that region, will there be enough there? Whereas if customers pick different regions for their usage, they've got a much better chance. We always stress regional flexibility. I never really want to be tied to having to use this region and having to use this SKU. The more flexibility I have in my region, in my zone, in my SKUs, the much greater the chance I'm always going to be able to get the resource I need. And also a challenge I can have here are feature gaps. The paired region may not have all the features I want. It could be certain SKUs. It could be things like AZs. So some of the paired regions, one of them has availability zones, but one of them doesn't. So if I'm thinking of my architecture, my resiliency, that could be a problem. And you really have to think back to the start. When Azure first kicked off, there were a lot less regions. And so these pairings maybe made more sense. There were a lot less services. And also, I suspect in those very early days, it was a much different network that existed. And so when they offered services like storage GRS, well, not only was there an architecture of, I suspect, storage, how it did the replication, but they'd also have to make sure there was very huge amounts of robust network connectivity between those regions. Because the sheer volume of data that goes through storage, I think, is a multitude of times different from like relational databases, for example. So just massive amounts of data would have to transfer. Now, we're in a different world now, it's a different network. But in those early days, I suspect that was part of it. Additionally, in those early days, there weren't availability zones. So regions were the only mechanism I had to control the blast radius, because when I deployed something in a region, it could be anywhere, and I had no insight into that at all. Now, with those advancements, one of the things you see today is the idea of these regions that have availability zones, but they do not have a regional pair. So these newer regions, none of these have a regional pair. And the implication of that obviously means, well, if there's no regional pair, certain services will not be available. For example, it will talk about, well, you will not have that option of the geo-redundant storage. But instead, you focus on things like zone-redundant storage. You pivot that focus of the blast radius to using availability zones instead of using the regions. And then for your DR or your much larger geo-resiliency, you just use whatever region you want. And so if we consider this new world that we're moving to and some of the examples we're already seeing, so you have these examples of, okay, there's some region here, region Y, and it has AZ1, AZ2, AZ3 that I see for my subscription. So there's 3 available, but there's no pair. Which is why you'll hear this sometimes called 3 plus 0. Got 3 AZs, but there is no pair available for it. And then if you start to really extrapolate that out, if you look at other services, they don't care about the regional pairings. Like if I was to think of data services, I'm in a certain region, I have my primary writable copy of my relational database or whatever it is, they just let you go and create replicas, often in multiple regions, wherever you want. They do not care about those pairings at all. Things like Cosmos DB that are the multi-master set of capabilities, I could have nearly all of the regions lit up and all of them making changes, and I get a certain consistency based on what I configure. If I would think of the compute services, I can't think of any of the compute services off the top of my head that expand beyond the region anyway. They're always within a region. So, hey, I've got some region, well, my compute service lives within a region. I create another instance of my compute service, like a different AKS cluster, a different app service, a different virtual machine scale set in another region. And then my data tier that has the state, I'm using something like this to replicate that state over. And then when I think about, well, I want to use these, and maybe I'm moving more to an active-active type scenario, whatever it is, or still could be active-passive, there's some global balancing solution. This could be Azure Front Door. It could be Traffic Manager, could be the global load balancer. they don't care about the regional pairs. They can point to everything in the world. They just don't care about those regional pairings. So if I think newer data services, the compute services, the networking infrastructure, none of that cares about the regional pairings at all. So I just don't have to worry about that. But of course, there are those things, storage GRS, Key Vault replication, the Azure staged rollout, they do care about those pairings. So what do I do then if in my architecture I choose not to use the pairings? Am I just stuck? Can I not do anything there? So let's dive into those. So let's start with the idea of storage. So if I'm using a storage account, so that is the unit we're talking about. Now, when I think of a storage account, remember, a storage account lives within a specific region. Now, within the storage account, I have many types of service. I have blob. Now, that blob could be the traditional blob where it's a flat namespace. There's no folders. If you see folders, it's just part of the name. It's not a true folder structure. So that could be the flat namespace, or maybe I've turned on that hierarchical namespace. We call that the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So I have blob, I have files, I have SMB, I have NFS capabilities. Then you have things like queue, and then you have table. Now, table is getting used less and less. Obviously, Cosmos DB replaces a lot of the things I would do there, but they still get used a lot. So I have these capabilities as part of a storage account. And then very, very easily, as part of that storage account, I say, well, I want to turn on GRS. That's all I have to do. It's a super simple option. And then what that will now do is actually fairly low down in the Azure Storage 3-tiered architecture. It will start replicating the data to the paired region. So now it is doing this asynchronous replica. So the asynchronous is important that it's not going to impact the performance of the application right into the storage account, but it's just going to send it over as quickly as it can. Now, when I say as quickly as it can, because this is just everything in that storage account, it replicates over. It's fairly low down in the architecture. This is probably going to be your lowest latency, fastest option. So it's a very fast option. It's not having to worry about applying a filter or looking at a change feed. You're in this storage account. I'm going to copy you over. But with that, it's everything. It's all of the content. I have no control over what it replicates. So it's all of the types of service. It's all of the content. It must be the same tier. So I can't use a different tier on the other side. So it's the same tier, which means from a cost perspective, it's fairly expensive. Whatever it's costing, you basically double the cost, and then you have some data transfer. So I can't use things like, hey, I'm hot over here. Let's use cool or cold over there or archive over there. It won't let me do that. And so we're really using this in a DR scenario. Now, there are things like GRS RA, read access. So potentially in my architecture, if I'm running an active, I may have some of the services let me go and read from it. So there might be an aspect of that. But really, it's just about, for DR, hey, if there's a disaster and it fails over, and I can actually do user-initiated failover, I can go and look at what is the current state of that replication. That's where we are. So I don't want to use the paired region. I want to go and use something else. So that's the paired region. Well, what do I do if I want to go and use this region? We call this other region. Anything you want. Well, the good news is what we can now do is you have an object level replication. Now, the way the object level replication works is if I think of this blob, for example, and specifically I'm going to focus on the flat namespaces where it is right now. That blob, what I actually do is it's broken up into containers. So I could have like a container 1, a container 2, container 3, container 4. And that has the blobs in it. Now, the same thing applies over here. In this, I create a completely different storage account. It is not some paired relationship with this storage account. So over here, I would just create storage account 2. And that, again, for its blob service, it would have its structure. Container A, container B, container C, container D, etc. And now what I do is I create these object level replication relationships. So I'm going to say, hey, this container here, I want to set up a replication to this container in this storage account over here. So I'm doing now this object level replication. And one of the nice things about here is every object is replicated individually. Now, because of that, I need a few things on this storage account. So on this storage account, I have to have versioning. Now, over time, versioning will start to accrue many, many different versions. So it will cost me more money. So one of the things I would probably partner with this is lifecycle management to go and clean these things up. But the great thing about versioning is I get that really nice, strongly consistent atomic sets of operations against it. I also need the change feed because the change feed will give me that guaranteed ordering as I'm copying the things over here. I get that guaranteed consistency. Now, what this means is, with all of this, I can actually apply a filter. So I don't have to replicate everything in that container. I could add a filter. Hey, the name has to start with so-and-so. So it's selective replication there. But of course, that means the process is trawling through the change feed. And it's comparing those filters. So it means it's going to be a bit slower. So I have to consider that. But because I've got this complete control, it's really an any-to-any relationship between the accounts. I don't have this strong have to use the paired thing anymore. The tier could actually be different. So one option I could do is I could run call over here. I could run a lower tier and save me some money. Challenge is, it is only blob and it is only the flat namespace today. Doesn't do data lake, doesn't do file, doesn't do queue, doesn't do table. It's primarily used for HA, high availability, but I could use it for disaster recovery as well. And so if my use case is blob flat namespace, I could use the object replication as an alternative to using the GRS, and I can do it to any region I want, and I get great flexibility. Yes, the latency is going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be a little bit slower. If I was in just massive amounts of transactions per second, I may see that even more. But for most customers, it's not going to be anything you would really ever notice about it. There are, of course, other options. Ultimately, something is interacting with this. So another option could be I have my application. So I have some app. Well, many different things could happen here. As part of the application, when it writes to both. Now, what that means is I'll get super strong consistency because it's almost a synchronous replication, but the app will take the hit on the time it takes to write to whichever that slowest, furthest region is. So the app will take the hit on that latency, but I'll get phenomenal consistency in that. Another approach could be, well, I have some trigger, I have an event, or I could poll. And we have things like event gid can help. So maybe it's a trigger, maybe I'm polling, and that triggers the app, which then goes and reads from here and goes and writes it to the other one. So I could write my own. And I could even leverage things like AZ copy. AZ copy could be used to, hey, copy content from here to some other storage account. Anything can be solved. Depends how much ownership you want to take on of that process. But if it's just blob and it's the flat namespace I think that's coming. I think it's on the roadmap, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I suspect it would be. I can use object replication. For the other things, well, my app could write to both, or I could write a logic app or an Azure function that gets triggered from event grid when something happens here that goes and reads it and writes it to the other one. Or I can set up AZ copy to do that synchronization between them. There's options on what I can do. So I can solve it. It's just how much work do I want to take ownership of? Okay, so that was storage. And we think, okay, I can deal with the storage side. So let me get the Key Vault replication. And the Key Vault replication is tied a lot to the GRS. I think under the covers, it's probably using Blob. And so then if that was storage and how that works, well, now I need to work on Azure Key Vault. So now we have Azure Key Vault. And once again, I have a vault. So I have a vault that lives in a specific region. And then under that vault, we have really 3 different types of asset. I can have a secret. Remember, a secret is something I can write to it and I can read from it. It might be a shared access signature. It could be a password. But I can both read and write that. I can have certificates. And a certificate is also something, now there's a private key element as well, but that lifecycle is managed there, and I can go and fetch that certificate. I can create new certificates. And then we have keys. Keys are tricky in that once they're generated or imported into the Key Vault, I can't get it back out again. I can use it to perform cryptographic operations, but I can't just take the private key and then go and copy it wherever I want to do. And Key Vault is one of the first ARM services we had way back, I think it's 2014. And if I think about how Key Vault is used, it's mostly read access. I'm reading a secret, or I'm performing some operation, a cryptographic operation with a key. Very rarely I'm actually pulling the things out. And once again, these have the pairings. The idea being if the primary region failed, the DNS that points to the Key Vault would fail over to the cluster in the paired regions, and I would be good to go. Now, when I think about operating with this, imagine this did fail over to the paired region. So we have that replication. And let's say I was using a different region. I'm over here. Generally, the secret use and the cert use are not latency sensitive. I.e., if it took an extra 50 milliseconds to read the secret, as long as my app is not garbage and I'm getting it every time, I'm not caching it in some way, the cert I'm probably not constantly rereading, the extra bit of latency, if this failed and my compute was over here, but the Key Vault replica was here, it would probably be fine. Now the key, that's probably a different matter. I'm probably, if I am using the keys, I'm doing the cryptographic operations, that latency may impact my application. So what could I do? What are my options here? Because I can't go and grab the keys. Now, one of the things I could do is you can back up and restore. So one option would be, hey, I can take my vault. I can do a backup. I spelled backup wrong. There's generally not an R at the end of backup. Take a backup. And I could then go and restore that to another region. So we have our other region over here. Yes, you can, but the way Azure Key Vault works is you have a security world, which is the country, which means, yes, I can do this, but it has to be the same country. Now, in the United States, China, it's probably okay. I have lots of different regions in the same country. Europe, nearly every region is in a different country, which would render this not super useful for you. So realize that constraint. I can't restore a backup from a different security realm. A security realm is the country. So in the US, sure, I could take a backup and I could restore it to any of those US regions. So I get flexibility there. Outside of the US, most of the other regions, it's maybe only one region or two regions, which are probably the pairs anyway. It wouldn't work. I can't restore to a different security realm. So what else can I do? Well, another option is we can use the managed HSM. If I use the managed HSM, it lets you pick. So now I'm not restrained to what those paired regions are. So that would work. I could bring my own key. I could have my own HSM on premises, but then I have to make sure I always have the good access to that. There's also events happening all of the time here. So once again, another option for these things is we write an app. And once again, there's different options on how I could write this. So I could think about, okay, I've got some app. So either it gets triggered by event grid, for example, hey, there's a new version of the secret. And so it could then go and write it to a different key vault somewhere else. Same for the cert. Another option could just be my app as part of my change control or anything else. When it updates it, well, let's do a different color on that one, actually. Another option would be it could just write it to both of them. So once again, like the storage, it is taking ownership of keeping them synchronized. So Azure Function, Logic App, triggering. If I've got something that has to rotate them periodically, it writes it to both copies, removes me from those pairings. But, and there's a challenge with this, in this new security world, with all of the things we always think about, we think blast radiuses. And the but here is I want to avoid global secrets, certs, keys. We really don't want them. We want to try and limit blast radius. If a secret is exposed, I don't want it to expose the world. If I have to roll a TLS certificate, well, I don't want it to take down the entire service while it rolls. Maybe it just takes down one region. And so what we'd actually ideally be thinking about here is, well, there's a secret one in this region. There's a cert one over here. There's a key one over here that's being used by this region. And then in this other region, it has a secret too. Completely different. I'm not sharing things between the regions, so I don't have to synchronize them. There's an isolation in all of these things. I have different TLS certs for different services in the different regions. I have different secrets, different keys. So that is what I would try and do. And also, do I need them? Like secrets, could I just get rid of the secrets completely? Could I use things like managed identity? Often we're using them for credentials or shared access signature. Do I need that? Could I use managed identity? Could I use OAuth federation? Like really take a look at why I'm doing this thing and do I really need it? Like, because things change. I talked about Azure has grown, Azure's got new services. There's all of these things happen. Am I doing some architecture that used to be the right thing to do, but there's a better option now? And again, we're in a different security world now. So if I was thinking before, Ben, I use the same cert everywhere, the same key everywhere, the same secret, we probably don't want that. They're generally hugely frowned on now. You should look at your app and work out, how can I break these into separate sets for whatever my silo of my compute and my data is, so they're independent. I don't have some compromise or some action I have to take that would impact globally anything. I never want these global really things anymore. If I can get rid of that, fantastic. So I'm going to say, that through one way or another, I can kind of handle the Key Vault thing. Either we don't want the global things, or I can write something to do it. I'm there. Azure Staged Rollout. Now I think let's go this way up this time. So Azure Staged Rollout is a very interesting one. And there's been some really good articles on this. So Microsoft released a blog, I think it was Mr. Razinovich, the Azure Safe Deployment Practices. And the only thing I want to call attention to, and it's a great article, is this picture here. This is how they roll out changes. So you can think there's lots of internal testing, lots of internal validation. It goes to the canary regions, which customers can sign up for. Then there's the pilot region and some smaller regions, then some early regions, and then the broad rollout, the regional pairs. One of the ones from the pair, and then the other one from the pair, and then the sovereign clouds, etc., etc. So if we think of that picture for a second then, so what was drawn out here, if I think about the Azure updates, there's all the internal stuff, but then as a customer, the first thing I could ever see would be Canary, which I have to sign up for. That's the early user access preview. So that's a ring. Then from there, it goes to some pilot considered regions, the first access. Then it goes to kind of the early regions. And only after that does it then go to the broad. So it's one of the pair 1, then it goes to the pair 2, and then it would go to the sovereign regions, the gov clouds, etc., etc. And what's nice about this and why we care so much is there's a bake-in time. So between each of them, you have this concept of a bake-in time. And I think commonly it's 24 hours. That can change for different types of updates, but you can roughly think there's a day between each of those things. And so in terms of time to see if there's a problem, hey, there's a whole day I'm going to take to see if there's an issue before it rolls out. And that's very attractive. Now there's another bake-in time happening within the region. So if my region supports availability zones, you also have the idea of within here, okay, there's my AZ1, 2, and 3. And once again, there's a little bake-in time. So there is bake-in time between each of these. They do not roll out anything at the same time to the AZs. So AZ1 would get it, waits, AZ2 will get it. But this is not 24 hours. This is a much shorter amount of time. And I don't know if there's an exact time they specify, but maybe it's like an hour, maybe it's 2 hours, but it's a much, much shorter amount of time, but it does exist. And they've also done a lot of work that as they make changes, they ensure they don't have this change to AZ1, that one to AZ2, and a different one to AZ3. They try and combine them all to make sure I'm only going to potentially impact one at a time. So what this is useful for now, consider this, if I'm running active, right? So if I was an active deployment in using both of these, if suddenly one of my regions was hit and I'm using the regional pairs, well, the other one I should have a day before it's impacted. So I know at least the other one is still going to be up and running. So that's a good thing. What if I'm active-passive? Now I've got a 50-50 shot of this being useful, because you might say, well, no, that's good. I fell over to the DR site. The DR site won't have the change yet. Really? How do you know? I don't know if my active happened to be the one that's first. I might be lucky, and my active is this, and my passive is the second one. But I could just as also likely be my passive was first, and my active. So that wouldn't do any good. Now, I would call up support and they would probably tell me if the changes happened there or not, but realize that may or may not be useful in that scenario. Whereas if I'm using the AZs, I'll always be deploying. in a zone redundant or zonal silos. I'll be using all three of them. So I'm guaranteed that even if one gets hit, the other two will not be impacted because I'm running in all of them. And that's the key point. In any of these things, just having things in multiple regions is useless if they're not being used. I would generally recommend to customers, if you can't get into the canary, we'll try and get your test environment running in the pilot regions. But that's useless unless I'm running stuff in it. Because just because I'm deployed here, if there's some problem, I won't know. The only way this is useful is you have to have kind of this automated testing happening 24 hours a day. And I have to have the monitoring to detect failures, to detect variances from my baseline of what is healthy. Because then, sure, if I've got my test environment running in pilot or an earlier region, if I'm testing it, functional testing, stress testing, I could use Chaos Studio to inject some failures. I could use Azure load testing to get some traffic. Fantastic. Then I'll actually notice if there is a problem. But if all I do is deploy a test to a pilot or an early access region and it's sitting there idle, it's not helping me at all. I have to have the stuff running to see if a problem happens, which is the problem here. If I'm active passive and it happens to be, well, my active is on the second one that gets it, it won't really help me. I won't necessarily be able to fail over. And so the goal here then is really twofold, I would say. One, try and get your dev test into earlier regions and have good automated testing running with good monitoring so you see a variance, you see a failure early, which will hopefully stop the problem getting to your production ever. But start to pivot to the AZs and make sure I'm deploying in all of the AZs and I'm running active, 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 because then if there is some issue, have the quality monitoring. So again, it's always going to come back to always, I need quality monitoring in place to detect failures, to detect a variance from the baseline, because it may not even be a failure. It's something that's slowing down, something that's happening. And if I've got good monitoring for the Azure resources, for if there's an operating system, for the runtime, for my app, I have synthetic transactions running end to end. I want all of that going. If I've got that quality in place, I'll see failures, I'll see variances from my baseline, I'll see it quickly, I can work with support and try and mitigate that. So for me, I think the solutions here are, well, really good automated testing, quality monitoring, and the reality is you would just start to pivot to the AZs instead of the regions, because again, unless I'm active, using the paired regions may not help you. Because if my active is the second one, it's already got that rollout there anyway. So I think that's the key point around those things. But I do want to be super clear. I mean, this is a potential benefit if I'm doing it the right way. I get this nice 24-hour period. So this one's hard. I don't think I can just tick that one. It's maybe. It's like a shrug. I don't know. Depends on my architecture, whether I can do that. The priority region fix, again, I've generally not seen that a huge thing anyway, but just something to consider. When I am thinking about the regions to use, some services do share their order. So if I look at AKS, for example, it tells me, well, it always deploys to, this is its regional status. And actually, I think it's release order. Here we go. So it tells me by region, and it says, well, it always does West Central US first, then East Asia, then UK South, then East US. And then there's this whole bunch of them. So this is very obviously region pair 1, and then region pair 2. And then it goes off and does the sovereign clouds, US Gov Texas, China. So that's actually pretty obvious to see. So if I was a big AKS user, I'd probably try and stick my dev test in West Central. That would get me the earliest possible visibility into things coming down the line. API management shares a little bit of information. So they talk about the canary, but then they talk about pilot, and they say their pilot is West Central US as well. So you kind of see a little bit of commonality that West Central US, from these two pieces of evidence, seems to be the pilot region. So I might think, ooh, West Central US, I'm using API Manager, I'm using AKS, other things. Hey, I'll try and move my test environment into there. So I'm going to see it as early as possible. And so then some of the services share and it might help you. But again, it could change. They all say this could change. So I don't know if I would bake my whole architecture around it. I think maybe the biggest thing you can do is use as many regions, like try and get away from just being an active passive. Can I be active, 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 active? Can I be in more places? That will give you a lot of protections from different types of failure, but also making sure I can always get the resources I want. I think there's a lot of benefit to going to that approach. So to summary then, there were a lot of things to think about. For both the storage and the Key Vault, I think there's solutions. For the storage, for the blob, we can use object replication. Gives us a lot of granularity, a lot of control. I may even be able to save money because I can use different tiers over here. If it's some of the other types of service, maybe I write something to write to both, or I have some trigger and I read and write it to the other, I can use AZ copy. For Key Vault, yes, there are things I could do to write new secrets, new certs, generate new keys. There's things I can do. Maybe I can back up and I can restore. If I'm in the same country, that's probably going to be the US. I can use managed HSM to get flexibility. But honestly, the answer to this one is stop it anyway. You shouldn't be having a global secret. You shouldn't be having a global cert. I shouldn't be having a global key. I don't want those single things throughout my entire organization. Always think the blast radiuses, think minimize the impact, get rid of them. Find siloed ways to do different TLS certs, different cryptographical keys. And can I just get rid of the secrets entirely anyway? Use managed identity, use OAuth federation. There's other things I can do. For the Azure update rollouts, sure. Realistically, I think that bake time is attractive, but realize it's only useful if I'm maybe lucky with which one is my active, which one passive. If I'm active, then yes, it definitely gives me a 24-hour bake time. I would recommend just to try and see the things coming early. Make sure you get as early as possible your dev test, but you need that automated testing and quality monitoring to make it useful. But really the focus is for production, as many regions as possible, active, 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 and use the availability zones. They have a bake time as well. And that was it. I mean, that was I think, okay, if I can't use the paired regions or I don't want to use the paired regions, what can I do? Hopefully that helps, gives you some ideas. And just always be open. Don't just think, okay, this is how it's architected. I have to stay that way. The chances are Azure has evolved. There's new services, there's new capabilities that maybe lets me pivot the way I'm doing it and I can adjust. Till next video, take care.